Okay, we're going to talk about the dinosaur hunters today. You know, I grew up in an area that is still well known for dinosaur finds. That is in Montana, and the first T-Rex was found in Montana near where I grew up. And so as a young kid, of course, you could see what my mind was filled with, with just all kinds of things going on in there. And I found my first big dinosaur bone when I was in second grade. It was actually quite by accident. I was on my way home from school, grade schooler, and decided to take a shortcut up the alleyway. And of course, the alleyways up in Montana are lined with rock from typically the Yellowstone River. And so in that are all kinds of petrified wood and dinosaur bones and so on. And one probably rolled out that was too big to put into the alleyway, so the workers probably kicked it out of the way, and there it sat until young Nurre comes along and spots it. It was a big part of a femur of a big dinosaur. And so that's when the bug bit me, and I've been interested in dinosaurs and fossils ever since. Now, all of us have heard something to do with the bygone days of the great dinosaur hunters, and the whole of American paleontology is actually rooted in this particular time period that I'm going to talk about tonight in American history. And in fact, until this time, only about 3 dinosaurs had been discovered, and they were known from European bedrocks. And so there wasn't much, and this was just really scrappy material. Everybody was under the impression that the future of dinosaur paleontology was going to be in America, and particularly in the West. There had been Ferdinand Hayden, of course, he was the one who did the big exploration of Yellowstone Park. He was also a rock hound, a fossil hunter, and so some of the word began to travel back and around the world, and so people got excited about what might lay in the American West. And so when we talk about the dinosaur hunters, we're really talking about this period of time we call the Bone Wars. How many of you have ever heard of the Bone Wars? We got a few of you who've heard of the Bone Wars, sure. In other words, it was really the Great Dinosaur Rush, that's what it's called, primarily from 1877 to 1892. Now, there were a few years before this preliminary exploration going on by a couple of people. But this was taking place in the area where the Great Sioux War took place. So these guys were at times chased by Indian war parties. At other times they were caught in between skirmishes between cavalry and Indians. And so it's kind of an exciting story. There's a DVD set put out by Michael Crichton. Actually, it's a CD set put out by Michael Crichton. And I've listened to the whole thing. Actually, my wife and I did. Driving back from Yellowstone last year, we decided to go ahead and listen to it. Somebody had given it to me as a gift. And I just remember listening to it, and it's an exciting story, but about half of it's just false. They just don't have the story down. And this, of course, it's all the little tidbits that make the story. And part of this great story is really centered in on how a few men shaped American paleontology. And what we have today is really as a direct result of these guys that were part of this great dinosaur rush or bone rush. It's also a study in the nature of man. We like to think of our scientists as being pure and white-coated, but there was some very nasty stuff that took place. And of course, that is part of the whole story as well. This particular drawing here is actually from one of the books that was put out for the Bone Wars, the things that were going on during that time. This is actually a print. And so you can see, I mean, this shows the sun in the distance and the wagons rolling over the prairies. And that's about what it was like. They went out there and they gave their lives to finding dinosaur fossils. So it's an exciting story, but it's also got a lot of stuff in it that I think it'd be great for us just to kind of center in on and ask the question, boy, what really happened then? So first of all, let's define paleontology. Every kid wants to become a paleontologist. I did too when I was a kid. The word comes from two Greek words meaning the study of ancient life. So built into the definition right away is the assumption that life is ancient. And it's not something that's actually been proven. It's just an assumption. It is the scientific study, says one resource, of life that existed prior to and sometimes including the start of the Holocene epoch. That's what we live in now, particularly roughly 11,700 years before the present. Archaeology kind of takes over at that time and they sort things out. But after that time, it's paleontology that pretty much concentrates on that. It includes the study of fossils to determine, now here's the assumption, organisms' evolution and interactions with each other and their environments, their paleoecology. So that is the assumption. And doubters are not welcome. You must go into it with that. And this is where I think a lot of young people either get their bubble burst or their faith lost, one of the two. You generally go through and get a geology degree, and then from there you go on and specialize in paleontology. So by the time you get to paleontology, it is assumed that you have gotten every bit of religion that might be hanging on taken out of the way here, as they are very rabid about this. Paleontologists today are out to destroy anything that has to do with the flood. This was the way it was too back in the 1800s with a fellow by the name of Charles Lyell, who in his personal writings, I never learned this in college, but in his personal writings, he made it known his personal goal was to eliminate any influence of Genesis on geology. And I would say he was pretty successful. By the end of the 1800s, there wasn't one geologist that was known for interpreting Earth history in light of the Scripture. It was really in the early part of the 20th century that the Seventh-day Adventists kind of took up the mantle, and for many years, they were the ones who kind of protected that. Some of their writings, I've read several of their books, some of them are very, very good. It defended a literal interpretation of Genesis and a view of the flood. And then, of course, we all know in 1961, the landmark book, The Genesis Flood, came out, and he really makes mention in that book a lot of the contribution of the Seventh-day Adventists. Okay, well, the paleontology assumptions are these. First of all, the evolution of life from a common ancestor. Fossils definitively document ancient life. They go into it with that, and every fossil they pick up and look at it, whether it's a bone, a tooth, whatever it is, it's there to document the evolution of ancient life. Second of all, they build naturalistic explanations. The Bible is not welcome. Nothing that involves any kind of supernatural intervention or supernatural explanation is even permitted. They won't even talk about that. Deep time, in other words, millions of years, that's an assumption. Ancient environments and ecologies, that's another assumption. They just assume when they look at a set of rock layers that represents an ancient environment instead of laid down by the flood. Science, of course, cannot answer the question, can it? It is based on a worldview. They also teach that the Christian scriptures are ancient myths that have no relevance in science. Now, here's the problem this creates for the students and for the believers. A straightforward reading of Scripture teaches a young earth and a global flood. Unless you tie it up in pretzels and you play the game of eisegesis, the straightforward reading of Genesis is really clear. There was a creation, 6 days, a day of rest, seventh day with evening and morning. And then about 1,600 years later, there was the flood. And that's pretty clear. So it is a conflict. And some deal with that conflict by just simply compromising. Others are racked with emotional trouble because they realize that they have to abide by the code if they're going to make it anywhere. I've been working with a young woman who's graduating actually from Laramie this year. I tutored her in high school. She was going to go on to Laramie in geology. And so I just spent a whole year tutoring her on what she could expect. And she made it through. She's done very, very well. And now she's applying for a scholarship for some more study. And she wrote me and wanted to know if I would give a recommendation. And I told her, sure, I'd be glad to, but you ought to consider one thing. The form I have to fill out identifies me, who I am. And once they know my connections, they're going to equate that with you too. And I would say that you would not have your scholarship. And it would be my recommendation that you just continue on with what you're doing. And if you have enough recommendations, go ahead, use them, but leave me out of the picture. It's because I am a pariah at this point. And she said, boy, I never thought about that. But you see, the questions they ask on this form to identify me, I mean, they know exactly what they're looking for. And if I am a young earth creationist, this blight goes on her too. And so it's a very real warfare out there. So we've really got two conflicting stories and two presentations of Earth history, and they are diametrically opposite. And they do tell two different stories. You cannot harmonize those two stories. They are opposite. Here's the challenge, though. It's not a story that can be told by science, and here's why. Science deals with that which can be observed, tested, and repeated. And so nothing really of ancient life or ancient paleoecologies and so on cannot be verified by science. There is no way to test it. There's no way to observe it. And there's no way to repeat it. It's accepted dogma. And that's what we have to work very hard oftentimes with people on the other side, don't we? We have to help them see that that's exactly what they're doing. In order to construct an Earth history, you must rely on interpretation based in a worldview or in recorded historical testimony. Now, this is where, of course, the Bible is the strongest. It is recorded historical testimony. In constructing Earth history, this all began with a fellow by the name of James Hutton, father of modern geology, in his book, The Theory of the Earth, in 1795. And by the way, Hutton was one of the fathers of the Scottish Enlightenment. I was never told that when I studied geology. I was taught that he was a physician and broke free from the religious shackles of the church and came up with his conclusions based on hard scientific evidence. I mean, that's the way the story is presented to you. But he had these ideas long before he wrote Theory of the Earth, because he was one of the fathers of the Enlightenment. Of course, the quest of the Enlightenment was to get rid of everything that had to do with the church, with scriptures, and with the idea of an all-knowing God. And in the Theory of the Earth, concerning us, a couple of things that he taught were, one, the world was not created in 7 days, and the world was not 6,000 years old as calculated by genealogies of Genesis. He was very clear about this. And this is where modern geology began. The stuff that I studied in college was as a direct result of this man here. He's called the father of modern geology. The historical scriptures that Jesus not only trusted but fulfilled included a recent creation and a global flood. In fact, Jesus talked about these two. And I always like to tell people, look, Jesus, everybody acknowledges at least that Jesus was a great moral teacher. The real problem I have with that is if he knew there were problems with Genesis and challenges with Genesis, and yet he continued to teach a very strong view of the scriptures, then he was not a great moral teacher. He was a great deceiver. And we have to wrestle with that. And I think the more that we do, the more we're going to find we're just at odds with the modern view of Earth history. Now, here is the shape of paleontology today. This is an excellent book, by the way, if you can get your hands on it, Hunting Dinosaurs. I found it just fascinating. It's one of the more recent books. But here is the opening line of the book. He said, being a paleontologist is like being a coroner, except all the witnesses are dead, and all the evidence has been left out in the rain for 65 million years. Now, that would present quite a challenge to try to reconstruct dinosaur history. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, what are you going to do? What are you going to use? What are you going to refer to? And this is really true. You get up into eastern Montana where known as the Hell Creek Formation. It's actually named after a creek in Montana. A lot of paleontologists, though, will joke saying that that's really describes the shape of the dinosaur bones. And it's really true. They are in horrible, horrible shape. The area is known as Makoshika, and to the Indians, that meant bad land. And it is bad land. It is probably good for raising hay and cattle, and that is about it. But of course, the bones are all washed in there, and this is what they're having to construct dinosaur history from. But you don't have any witnesses, and the bones are all contaminated. So good luck with trying to put a history together. I like this cartoon of paleontology. He's looking at that, and he's leading people around. Says, we believe these dinosaurs died playing Twister, or perhaps became trapped in the same tar pit over time, but most likely it was Twister. See, and paleontology really is not exactly an exact discipline. It presents itself that way, but it isn't. There have been some very embarrassing mistakes made, and we're going to cover some of those tonight. Paleontology really does involve a lot of guessing and imagination. You've got to have a good imagination. And the finer that imagination is tuned to an evolutionary view of life, of course, the greater that kind of imagination is going to be. Typically, when you find dinosaur bones, this is exactly the way it looks. These are in a shape we call disarticulation. Disarticulation, by the way, is the rule when you are looking for dinosaur bones. They're all broken up and spread all over the place. And finding a complete dinosaur is just, it's just non-existent. Some of the smaller ones are more complete. I think the most complete T-Rex, for instance, and that's been one of the most abundant big dinosaurs found, has been about 65% complete, and that's about it. Now you can tell quite a bit, especially if you have the skull, but there is a lot missing, and we're going to see just how the artist got it wrong as we go through this. All of these are petrified bones, and that's all we have. In fact, the science is those are bones that have been petrified. In other words, infiltrated with some kind of a mineral-rich solution like silica or calcite or iron, pyrite. And this is all we have. And so you don't have an encyclopedia that you can follow, or a Chilton's manual, that you can refer to and put things together. It's all done by guess and by golly. Paleontology is considered to be an historical science. What a historical science is that which seeks to explain all of Earth history in terms of naturalistic assumptions and worldview. It's really a misnomer. Historical, like we said, history really needs eyewitnesses or records, written records of some kind, to be history. So when we call it a historical science, it's really a misnomer because it is actually seeks to construct Earth history by guessing. Paleontologists typically, and this is true with geologists too, start at the end of the book. And between the end and the front, there is nothing written. So they start at the end of the book with their conclusions, and they work toward the front, trying to reconstruct what happened to get to the end of the story. The biblicists do exactly the opposite. They start with a story that's been revealed to us, and they use it to interpret what they observed out in the earth. Two completely different approaches. Now, the historical sciences are cosmology, astronomy, astrophysics, geology, paleontology, origin of life, especially in biology. Biology is split between science and historical science, and archaeology. There was a time when archaeology was a little more pure in how they approached things, but today archaeology is assumes naturalistic explanations of life. And so we start with the Bible, and we seek to then interpret what we see outside. Believe it or not, the paleontologists find themselves in a circular frame of study. Here's why. They hold the key to the interpretation of the fossils. Number one, they define and set the rules that are used for interpretation. And number two, they determine the meaning of the bones. It's all circular reasoning, and it's very tight circle. They don't rely on any kind of history. In fact, in paleontology and geology, actual history really takes a back seat to what they call science. Here's another problem in modern paleontology. Artist renditions are fired by the imagination of paleontologists who have been influenced by the worldview of dinosaurs. If they want something to look more like what they think it was, they just have the artist draw it that way. And that's exactly what goes on. You can see here, virtually all theropod dinosaurs today are drawn and painted with feathers. When I was a kid, there were no dinosaurs with feathers. That was, so having lived then and then seeing what's happening now, every kid's growing up with a perspective on dinosaurs. And it was the theropods, they say, that had feathers. And so they're all being done like this. All these dinosaurs are actually legitimate dinosaurs. And if you look at the skeletons of these things from the 60s, you'll see there are no feathers on these guys, but today they're all pictured with feathers, and that's what the kids are growing up with. And so they control the key to knowledge on this thing. Now, the word dinosaur, it means terrible lizard. It was coined by Sir Richard Owen in 1842. And he actually thought that dinosaurs, and they didn't have much now, they had 3 they were working with, and those were very partial skeletons. But he thought dinosaurs were akin to the modern monitor lizard, and that's why he called them dinosaur, terrible lizard. Now, today you'll see a lot of writing of paleontologists refer to dinosaur meaning terrible reptile. Well, it's not. Owen did not use the word. The word reptile is the word herpeton, and it means a creeping creature. He did not use that word. He used the word saurus, and he meant lizard. The word dinosaur is really where we got our word dragon from. It's from the Greek word drakon, means a serpent, a huge land or sea creatures. In fact, the first person, one of the big dinosaur hunters, I'll mention him a little later here, who found the first pterosaur in the United States. It was in Kansas. When he published his description, he called him a flying dragon. That's what he called him. So they were very familiar with the interplay between the word dragon and the word dinosaur. They were all familiar with that. Now, they didn't have a lot of the myth and stuff that centered around it, but they all respected the term dragon, and they knew exactly what it meant. The word that is often translated into King James, dragon, comes from the Hebrew word tanin, which means a large sea beast or a large land beast. And that's translated in the very first chapter of Genesis 1. God created the great sea monsters. And it's the Hebrew word tanin. So these guys were all familiar with this stuff. Today, we're not. It has gotten buried and all but eliminated from our culture. It's a real shame, and the church seems to be drifting more and more away from any kind of an authoritative study or view of the Scriptures. We live in a culture, I think, that's much more devoted to expressing their feelings rather than respecting how God wants us to think and reason. Now, when Charles Darwin came along, 1859, he published his book, Origin of Species. All living things descended from a common ancestor millions of years ago. This is exactly what he thought. And so, as he published his material, everybody began to wonder about these dinosaurs. Where did they come from? What were their ancestors? Who was related to them? Were we related to them? And of course, the implications of Darwin's thinking was, yeah, we are related to the dinosaurs. And it's probably significant way back, but he is my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, and we are related to dinosaurs according to evolutionists. Now, here are these three dinosaurs that they had in collections. One of them was one called Megalosaurus. You can see there's the pelvic and a leg and a few other bones, a few teeth. That was Megalosaurus. There was Iguanodon, just simply from the teeth, and it's because the discoverer thought that the teeth looked like the teeth from a modern iguana. So don meaning tooth, they just called it Iguanodon. And he holds that name actually today as well. Then there was another confusing mess, disarticulated mess of bones called Hylaeosaurus, meaning forest lizard. Now, I defy you to put that thing together and tell me what it is. There are a few clues, but here's what the artists thought, and this is what the bone hunters in those days thought these dinosaurs looked like. You ready? Megalosaurus up on top, and Iguanodon on the lower left, and then Hylaeosaurus, the forest lizard, there on the right-hand side. And these are still in statue form today in Crystal Park in London. It was during Queen Victoria's reign. Her husband Albert helped construct the big show palace, the big crystal palace there in London, and had everybody come from all over the world to exhibit things. And some of the things that were on exhibit, of course, were these statues of dinosaurs. This was presented to the public. So this is what they thought about dinosaurs. But if Darwin's ideas were to be true, we needed to find the links from dinosaur to dinosaur, or from the ancestor to dinosaur, and dinosaur to us, and so on. So the quest for missing links really seriously started with this guy named Thomas Huxley. He's age 55 in this photo. You all know him as Darwin's bulldog, right? Well, he had another name too that not very many think about, and that was the bishop eater. He loved to debate pastors because, of course, pastors knew nothing of this stuff. And so they'd always resort to Scripture, and he would just tear them up and spit them out. So he was called the bishop eater. He's the one who debated Wilberforce back in those days. But Huxley really took this on as a mission to find the missing links. And the first one really that came up was this one. In 1861, there was a fossil of a bird feather, and of course the fossil there in the middle is 1862. It was Archaeopteryx. Both the feather and the bird fossil were Archaeopteryx. Now, it had a few strange things about it. Archaeopteryx did have wings, and it evidently could fly very, very well. But it also had something strange. It had teeth. And the teeth were interpreted to mean that he shared common elements with dinosaurs. Now, that's a big leap, as you can imagine. Just because a bird might have teeth doesn't mean that he shares a common ancestor. Some birds had teeth. They're evidently extinct now. Some birds can have lost the ability to fly. That doesn't mean they're evolving into something else. They've lost the ability to fly. Penguins are an example. Ostriches are another example. But in the fossil record, you do have fossils of birds that are extinct. You have fossils of modern birds in dinosaur rock layers. I don't know if you knew that, but modern birds have been found in dinosaur rock layers. And you have fossils of flightless birds. But you don't have any kind of fossils that shows the step-by-step migration from the dinosaur to the bird. Now, when Huxley got a hold of this, he had a dinosaur in mind. There was another dinosaur discovered during his day, and that was Compsognathus. He was just a little tiny critter. And he thought that he shared a lot of the similarities with Archaeopteryx. And so Archaeopteryx became the missing link and became the display of the missing link. This is what people were looking at. This is what I grew up with as a kid. Archaeopteryx is a missing link. And today, unless you find a person who's been studying this stuff, Archaeopteryx is still considered to be one of the best examples of a missing link. Still touted as that. But he could fly, and bird experts have looked at this, and he had the right bones. He was equipped to fly. He just doesn't exist anymore. So the idea was born. Here we go. Evolution from Compsognathus, a tiny dinosaur, to birds. Now, believers are often stumbled by this. Well, you see, there's the evidence. There's the evidence of transitional forms, missing links. And we're bothered by this. And I think the reason is that we don't know our scriptures. And so I'll let people know. I'll say, well, wait a minute. Well, let's back up a bit. When were birds created? Anybody know right off? Birds were created on day 5. Isn't that right? When were dinosaurs created as land creatures? In fact, all paleontologists will agree dinosaurs are land creatures. So if dinosaurs were created on day 6 as land creatures, how could you have dinosaurs evolving into birds? It won't work. Birds came first. If anything, it's birds who evolved into dinosaurs, you see. But I don't know. I think it's probably because, and I find this phenomenon a lot, it's quite common. We just don't know our scriptures. And so a lot of statements that are made by these guys, they end up stumbling us. And I think if we knew our scriptures better, we might be able to handle these things a lot better. So now let's move forward here to the 1800s, the later 1800s, dinosaurs in the American West. This is a period of time known as the Gilded Age of America. Probably the most positivist time in American history. This was, of course, the famous statement, move west, young man, move west, everything, conquer the West. And so people started exploring the West. And, of course, Yellowstone Park became a national park in 1872. So right around the same time of this great exploration that was going on. Probably the first guy that was considered a dinosaur hunter in this country was a guy by the name of Joseph Leidy, 1823 to 1891. He's the one who found the first hadrosaur in New Jersey, of all places, in some sedimentary formations. He was the first paleontologist of vertebrates in the U.S., and he had written extensively. Something else about him, though. 1856, he described the first complete dinosaur skeleton found in America. Leidy was also the first to use a microscope to solve a murder crime. Now, here's this brilliant scientist, right? He was an ardent supporter of Darwinian evolution. Isn't that interesting? Another famous guy about this time was this guy named Ferdinand Hayden. He's the one that led the expedition sanctioned by Congress to figure out this place in what is now Yellowstone National Park. And so he organized the expedition and took them out there, and it's the work that he brought back is really what finally convinced Congress they ought to protect this place, and that became our first national park. Now, Ferdinand Hayden had some quirks about himself. He was a rock hound. The military used to complain about him all the time because what he'd do is he'd fill up the supply wagons with rocks and fossils, and they were constantly complaining about him. And he'd disappear a lot of times, just disappear out, rock hounding, looking for fossils and stuff. One unfortunate day, he ran into a group of Cheyenne Indians. Now, Cheyenne during this time were notoriously violent. And any other person might have been scalped. But Ferdinand Hayden had all these packs full of rocks. Cheyenne wanted to know what he was doing. And they ordered him to dump his packs out. So he did. He dumped all his packs out. Nothing came out, of course, but fossils and rocks. And they thought he was crazy. That's what saved his life. The Cheyenne have this thing, the sacred thing about killing anybody who is insane. So they gave him a special name, though, and this kind of became his nickname. He who runs around picking up stones. That was his name given to him by the Indians. He had a student, and this student name really does figure in prominently into the dinosaur bone wars. His name was E.D. Cope. He was Joseph Leidy's student, and so we'll run into him a little bit later here, but he was really the one who started the bone wars, or the great dinosaur rush. And he came out to Montana and Wyoming during the time, of course, the great Sioux War. He was out there, and he was out there just with a few young students, and they had a wagon, some horses and supplies, and they went out looking for dinosaur bones. I still can't believe they did this. I mean, this is, I don't know, have you ever been out near Custer Battlefield? You get a chance to go out there, and let me tell you, there were no towns around during this time. It's a God-forsaken place. And so they were out there during the same time a lot of this stuff was going on. The Bone Wars actually started in competition with these two guys. This E.D. Cope was actually named Edward Drinker Cope, kind of an unfortunate name. And the other fellow was Othniel Charles Marsh, that's a biblical name. But he hated the name. He preferred to be called O.C. So that's what they called him. He was also affectionately known by his students from Yale as Uncle Charles. So these two guys began to war with each other, and the competition started in. They were so worried about each one finding more than the other. And in fact, there was a lot of stuff they did to one another's digs when they weren't around. They blew up remains. They planted certain things to preoccupy them in their digs. When the other left, they'd take in fossils and dump them in there so that they'd preoccupy the guy while they went around and looked. It was a nasty, nasty time. E.D. Cope was a Quaker he was raised as a Quaker, but he was a Lamarckian evolutionist. He really thought that the law of use and disuse best explained evolution. Very interesting, when his dad died, almost within a week or so, he declared himself to be a Unitarian, and that's how he died, was a Unitarian. Now, Unitarians in those days weren't quite like they are today, but the Unitarians definitely doubted the Trinity, doubted the deity of Christ, doubted the Scriptures, and but this is not how Cope was raised, but he began drifting that way more and more, especially as he started applying evolutionary ideas to the bones he was collecting. Marsh came from a family of missionaries, and he was an ardent supporter of Darwinian evolution. It was Marsh who gave us the picture of the evolution of the horse. You're all familiar with that, aren't you? You know, showing these horses with many toes, constantly losing the toes up until one toe, and if they've got it, you know, they've got it all structured out. You can see the evolution of the horse. That was Marsh's thing. One person summarized it this way: the efforts of these two men led to over 142 new species of dinosaurs being discovered and described. Today, only 32 are valid. Isn't that interesting? Many of these were changed since I was a kid. We'll look at a few of those. If you go into a roster of dinosaur names today, you just look at them. Of course, the one who finds them gets to name them, so they keep these names. But many of the names have been changed to a familiar Latin phrase, nomen dubium. Does anybody know Latin in here? It's playfully, it means I doubt it, you know, or I don't know about that. It means dubious name. And so many of these dinosaurs have got these new designations now, dubious name. They have been changed. And when I was a kid, for instance, Triceratops was considered to have about 21 different species. Today, they embrace maybe 2 species of Triceratops. And in some cases, Triceratops is thought not to be a separate species, but just simply a young teenage dinosaur. Isn't that interesting? You can see how really scientific this thing is. 75% of their work no longer accepted as valid. And that these two guys are the heroes of paleontology, American paleontology today. You may not have heard them. You read any book on the Dinosaur Wars, and these guys were, I mean, everybody knew. The Army protected these guys. They highly respected. They called them Professor Cope and Professor Marsh. And they really thought they were onto something. Here's some of the areas they spent time in. The western, of course, part of the United States, but they spent time in Nebraska, some of the first, Nebraska and Kansas, some of the first big finds, the Mosasaur, the Elasmosaur, the Pteranodons, things like this. They were all found in Kansas and Nebraska. They spent time in Colorado. It's often thought that the big dinosaur wars began right outside of Denver there, if you've ever gone to the dinosaur national monument there. Their story is there. Morrison, Colorado, is where it's thought to have begun. And actually, too, it was very, very interesting when there was a fellow already digging out there, and he began to discover these bones, and so he initially sent them to Marsh and said, "What do you want me to do with them? Do you want them? Do you want to buy them? Do you want to hire me?" And he sent several loads of bones to him and waited for a reply. Marsh never did reply. So what does he do? He sends a letter to Cope. And Cope sent him some money and said, "Yes, by all means, I want these." Well, when Marsh heard about it, he was furious. And so he starts to get involved in things out there. And each one had spies to keep track of what the other one was doing. They spent time in South Dakota, especially the Badland area. They spent a lot of time in Montana, some of the big, big finds from Montana. And in southeastern Wyoming, Como Bluff, that was probably the greatest discoveries of dinosaurs. Bones were found in southeastern Wyoming. And again, this is all frontier here. So every time they'd go out, they'd catch the railroad out to a certain, small town, had more bars and brothels in it than anything else. But that's where they would load up with their supplies and then take off to the dinosaur areas they thought were loaded with dinosaurs. They did a lot of work in New Mexico. Some of the big finds of dinosaurs have been found in New Mexico. In southwestern Wyoming, down in where there's New Mexico, Utah was a big one. They spent a lot of time in Utah and in western Texas in the red beds out there. But that's the area. You can see they covered a lot of area, just the two of them, with their students. They had some students, Marsh especially. His dad was Peabody. And so Peabody essentially built the museum there in Yale, and Marsh was installed as the first professor of paleontology at Yale University in this country. And so it helps to have a rich uncle. Anybody here in a rich uncle? Anybody here is a rich uncle? Nobody here is a rich uncle. That's too bad. I was going to hit you up. Here's Marsh's dig team. You can see him back in the center back there. Notice they're holding their rifles. You had to be a good shot as well as a good digger in those days. And there's Buffalo Bill Cody. He served as a guide for Marsh occasionally. Another summary of their work. Cope and Marsh were financially and socially ruined by their attempts to disgrace each other. Some of the things, and they used the newspapers, and of course I don't know if the newspapers are any different today, but they used the newspapers to blast the other one, and they'd print lies or half-truths, and of course it forced the other one to answer, and it wasn't a pretty sight. But we don't get taught this stuff today. This is all hidden, and I think it's good because these guys helped form American paleontology. And I think the paleontologists of today have these discussions among themselves, but they just as soon the public forget about it. He was the first professor of paleontology in America. He did more than any other scientist of his day to promote Darwin's evolution in America. And in fact, before Marsh came along, the idea of evolution was practically dead in this country. It just was not adhered to. It wasn't really talked about. No one really paid much attention to it. But it was Marsh who actually got the thing, brought it to the public attention. He gave us the modern evolutionary tree of the horse. And here's the sad thing about Marsh. He died with $186 in his bank account and 80 tons of fossil that filled 5 railroad freight cars. Isn't that interesting? Well, I'm taking some measures that I don't have 80 tons of fossils. My wife would not permit me to have 80 tons of fossils, I can assure you that. He never married. He died of pneumonia and quite alone. But that's really one of the big dinosaur hunters of America. His most famous guffaw was this one, Brontosaurus excelsus. How many of you old-timers remember Brontosaurus? Any of you? Yeah, I do. He was one of my favorite dinosaurs as a kid, Brontosaurus. And he's nicknamed the dinosaur that never was. And here's why. It was all because of a head. Marsh had diggers out in Wyoming, and they sent him back several crates of bones that belonged to a sauropod. He was missing feet and a head. The skull and the feet were missing, and so Marsh thought that he had discovered a new species of sauropod. So he attached sauropod feet, and also he fashioned a head from composite parts of another sauropod head. It became the first cultural icon for the public. And there you can see the head there. The original skeleton is missing the head. Brontosaurus, that was the name of it. And then Sinclair got into the act, of course the big Sinclair oil company, and they saw a good thing, so they put Brontosaurus on all their signs, and that's what you see today, still on those signs. You know, those green signs, right? You pay attention to that stuff. And that's supposed to be Brontosaurus. It was further captured by an artist, Charles Knight. Now, Charles Knight, one of the greatest artists in America, and he really brought dinosaurs and the kind of the prehistoric life in America. He really brought it to the forefront. It was his artwork. That picture there is a very famous picture. It shows Brontosaurus being a creature that dwelt in the swamps and not in deserts. Today, you see, they've totally changed the ecology which dinosaurs lived in. It's now desert. Whereas then, when I grew up, it was all marsh, and he had to exist there. He was too heavy to do anything else, they thought, and so he fed on all of the trees and the brush and everything else within the rivers. Here's a picture of Charles Knight. He made this painting down there in the lower left, famous picture of the tar pits in California. Have any of you been to the tar pits? Have you ever been down there? Yeah, downtown Los Angeles. There is an alternative view. This one really bothered me for a long, long time because it's the way they described it. It seems to promote a long age view of life, 30,000 years worth of life and skeletons and everything else caught in these tar pits. Well, further examination, that's not what happened at all. And so his artwork really helps cement the idea of a uniformitarian view of the tar pits in Los Angeles. Now back to his picture of Brontosaurus there in the marshes. See that book, The How and Why Wonder Book of Dinosaurs? That was the first book I read as a kid. That was what I was exposed to as a kid. And you can see there, Brontosaurus is lingering in the swamps, and his nemesis, Allosaurus, is in the background there. And you got to have some volcanoes in there, because that shows you the early Earth in the prehistoric times. Anything with a volcano confirms that it's prehistoric. Everything had volcanoes. In fact, do you remember the Time Life series that went around? You could unfold it, and every frame had a volcano in it. And very interesting. Well, paleontologists knew this about Brontosaurus, but they didn't tell anybody. It was kind of a secret. But the post office blew the lid off a thing in 1989. They issued 4 stamps as a commemorative set for dinosaurs. One of them was Brontosaurus. And the paleontological community came unglued. They accused the post office of spreading myth and lies about dinosaurs. And of course, the post office just comes back and says, look, you're the ones who told us, you know. So, but this was when the public found out that Brontosaurus was the dinosaur who never was. And I remember this and I felt really deflated. You know, here's my favorite dinosaur. And he wasn't really real at all. Were any of you traumatized by this at all? None of you, I suppose. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, a few of you were. But this is not the exception. This is the rule in dinosaur paleontology. And it may surprise you, too, how paleontologists put the geologic timetable together. It's based predominantly off fossil shells and the occurrence of fossil shells. But when they teach it, of course, as something different. Edward Cope. Now, the guy was a terrific and a prolific writer. He published over 1,400 papers in his life. It was the equivalent of publishing one a day. Now, you try writing a paper and publishing the thing. I mean, it's tough. It took me 1.5 years to write my first book. It's like pulling teeth. And of course, after you get done with your first one, then you've got it down. You know what you're doing. But 1,400 papers, more than any other scientist ever, including today. No other scientist has matched the amount of material that he wrote. Both he and Marsh were influenced by Lyell, Huxley, and Haeckel. Now, here's the very interesting thing here. You guys know who Haeckel was. He's a very dishonest evolutionist, and that's, of course, the famous. You know what's interesting here with this diagram? I picked up a book in Yellowstone last year. It's a brand new book because I'm studying the cyanobacteria there. There's a brand new book on cyanobacteria and the effect on the travertine terraces and so on. And it was really very well written, beautiful photographs in it. It's a wonderful resource. But this young scientist, it blew me away. He has a whole paragraph in there on the work of Haeckel as it refers to embryonic recapitulation. And he teaches it as if it was true. And I was just stunned when I read this, a brand new book. And I thought, I didn't think any scientist believed that stuff anymore. But evidently, he's learned it somewhere in some university. Young scientist. And Cope also lost an entire fortune. His dad left him the equivalent. I mean, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money. And he lost it in mining speculation. Lost a fortune, all of it, every penny. It's kind of a sad story. He died of a stomach illness. Most of his collection was bought from his wife by the American Museum of Natural History during this time. And he died with practically, he died in his study. He was so very, very destitute. Died in his study. And when they conducted the memorial there, it was reported that his collection of lizards and animals that he had collected while he was out, he was into everything. They were all running around the room. His turtle had a nickname, and he was crawling around the room. There were just a few people there at his memorial there, and it was quite a funny description. He died of a stomach illness. And in his latter days, he was separated from his wife. Although not divorced, the two of them just could not reconcile with what he was doing. And so it's a sad, sad story. He's remembered primarily for attaching a fossil head at the wrong end of a plesiosaur. And he found it, and he put it together and had the head on the tail as opposed to where it should have been. And Marsh pointed it out to him and then wrote about it. And of course, that didn't make friends. You see where these guys were? And these were the two big dinosaur hunters. Joseph Leidy, after a while, bailed out because he said, I cannot keep up with those guys, and I don't want to be a part of the fighting that's going on between them. So he just kind of left the whole field, turned to something else. One of the greatest dinosaur hunters that kind of overlapped this time into the 20th century was this guy, Henry Fairfield Osborn. He was the president of the American Museum of Natural History for 25 years. He's the one who bought Cope's collection, and it is on display in the American Museum of Natural History today. He was Times Man of the Year in 1928. He was a dinosaur hunter and an anthropologist. He also was the one who sent Roy Chapman Andrews off to China during that time. And of course, I was very excited about this because the Roy Chapman Andrews he was still very active when I was a kid. But there's a dark side of him, and that is this. He was actually a eugenicist, and I mean a rabid eugenicist. So was Margaret Sanger of Planned Parenthood. These guys were pushing for the elimination of anybody that was deemed unfit for establishing future life in America. This all took place in the 20th century. And he was at the thick of it. And the Nazis gave him an honorary degree from one of the German universities during the 30s. They honored him. They spoke very highly of him. The Nazis credit him with helping them to clarify their position on sterilization. As a matter of fact, he pushed for that. In America, during the early 20th century, America was involved in sterilizing, I think the number was finally about 63,000 people, just because they were deemed unfit to propagate. This went on in our country, and this is one of the biggest black eyes on science. Is this? There's a new book out. I'm trying to find it. It's called Unmasking Racism. It's done by a modern scientist today, and she documents a lot of this stuff. If I can find that book, I would love to have it, and I would recommend. I read a book review on it. It's just very, very telling, but it's a side of science that you really ought to know and ought to figure this out. I mean, this involved people like Henry Ford. There were a lot of people involved in this kind of thinking, and the Nazis found a lot of identification with it. Anyway, 1917, here's the big hoax. In Nebraska, there was a tooth that was found and sent to Henry Fairfield Osborn because he was the preeminent paleontologist of his day. And here's what the tooth looked like. So Henry Fairfield Osborn takes a look at it, and he pronounces it Hesperopithecus Harold Cookeye. Harold Cookeye was the guy who found it. But Hesperopithecus, and it means ape of the Western world. The primitive species of anthropoid ape is how Osborn described it. Here's a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Hesperopithecus. From that tooth, isn't that amazing? It's a brilliant detective work. The illustration, however, was really not of Hesperopithecus, but was modeled on the Java man. And Hesperopithecus, you can see, it's really kind of a complicated name to pronounce and remember, so it was nicknamed Nebraska Man. Does that sound familiar to any of you? Nebraska Man. Actually, though, the tooth of Mr. and Mrs. Hesperopithecus was actually the tooth of an extinct pig. Isn't that amazing? Later, it was discovered that the pig was not extinct at all, but alive and well. Well, so he has recruited a young dinosaur hunter named Roy Chapman Andrews, who died in 1960. So I was just, about 9, something like that, 10? I have to go back and figure. Any of you get like that to where it's so long ago, you have to stop and remember certain points. But I remember him as a kid, and he was actually one of my heroes. I read just about every book that he wrote, and it was an exciting tale of dinosaur hunting over in China. Originally, Osborne sent him over to China to find evidence of man's origin. And of course, he never found any, but he did find a lot of other stuff. And in fact, many think it was Roy Chapman Andrews who served as the model for Indiana Jones. He was quite the expedition. He went all over the world, brought back lots of stuff. He really researched a lot of things, and he led the American Museum of Natural History after Osborne for a while. But this is the connection into Hollywood. Roy Chapman Andrews was the first to use vehicles in dinosaur hunting. No longer were there wagons and horses, but he had his big vehicles shipped over to China in the Gobi Desert. And he took his team into the Gobi Desert and then hired a string of camels to bring in all the supplies and things to where they were going. He is also the first guy to find dinosaur eggs. Dinosaur eggs were unknown up until the 1920s. They had never been found. Tracks were even very, very rare. In fact, the tracks that were first found in Maine were thought to be birds from Noah's flood. Isn't that interesting? Large tracks. I've got a number of those in my collection. But those were thought to be, that's how they were published, bird tracks from Noah's flood, a remnant from Noah's flood. But anyway, over in China, he shipped back a lot of fossils. One of them that he shipped back was a skeleton of a dinosaur we now call Velociraptor. Not the Jurassic Park guy. Velociraptor was about 16 inches high, just a twerp of a dinosaur, but he'd never been seen before. Here's a book that I still have on my shelf, all about dinosaurs, Roy Chapman Andrews. It's really not about dinosaurs. It's really about his trip into China, which is exciting. Once you start reading the thing, you just can't put it down. It's very exciting. And this is where I looked for dinosaur bones and fossils along the Bighorn River. Of course, the Bighorn, the Little Bighorn connected up, and of course the rest is history for the Little Bighorn. But there's lots of stuff to do out there. But you can see how desolate it can really be. One of the big things that Roy Chapman Andrews found in the Gobi Desert was this critter called Paraceratherium. He was a giant rhinoceros. Look at the size of the skull. I had to really dig to find this picture, but it is a photograph, the original photograph. And he found that in dinosaur rock layers. Now, here's the rest of the restoration of the creature. You can see how big he was compared to modern day rhinoceroses. This was a huge beast. And there are lots of books. I've got every book on my shelf now that's been written about this creature. And there are about a half a dozen books. And but they never mentioned that he was found in dinosaur rock layers. And they never mentioned it was found by Roy Chapman Andrews. It's just this big, giant rhinoceros, it's called. And but he found that in dinosaur rock layers, where the dinosaur eggs were found, where the dinosaurs that Roy Chapman Andrews shipped home, where they were found. And it was a big mammal. Mammals were not thought to have lived any time near the dinosaurs. Today they accept only small mammals. The problem is that there are mammals, bigger mammals. In fact, one find here in the last 10 years was of a mammal who had a dinosaur in its stomach. And, this kind of stuff is out there. We just don't hear a lot about it. One of the other dinosaur hunters that influenced my thinking was Barnum Brown, called the King of Collectors. 1902, he discovered the first remains of T-Rex in Montana from 34 bones. That's all that existed of T-Rex at the time. And it was Osborne who named him T-Rex. Barnum Brown just shipped the bones, and Osborne named him. Here's any of you have ever heard of Charles Sternberg? Does that name ring a bell at all? Famous dinosaur hunter. In fact, if you go through Hays, Kansas, have you ever been through Hays, Kansas? Any of you? It's on Interstate 70 if you don't go to sleep. It's a wonderful place. They have a university there, but the Fort Hays State University is there. But the Sternberg Museum is there. And Sternberg was from Kansas, and he spent a lot of his life in Kansas, and many of his fossils are still there. Wonderful discoveries from Kansas. He's the one that discovered the mummy, the duck-billed mummy, and several other neat finds. I have both these books on my shelf. It's a wonderful story. He worked for Cope, and in fact was in Wyoming looking for dinosaur fossils when he got the news that Cope had died. He said it tore him up. He just had lost such a good friend. Cope was known for being very, very friendly and a wonderful guy, but he just had some strange ideas. Although paleontology gives the impression that it is a science free from the emotions and petty squabbles of lesser men and women, many frauds and damaged reputations have come out of paleontology, and the quest for fame and fortune. American paleontology is a child of fallen human nature. There's just so much more out there on the dinosaur wars. I read every book I can on it because it does tell me these men and what they believed and how they were influenced, especially by Darwin. And it was actually Marsh who saved the idea of evolution in Europe too. Until Marsh came up with his evolution of the horse, Huxley and Darwin were about ready to throw their hands up because there were no fossils being found that could be shown as links in the system of evolution. But it was Marsh's evolution of the horse that really saved it and kicked it off really in America. Well, one of the things I wanted to let you know of kind of an opportunity you might have. We do a Yellowstone expedition every year, and one of the things we do is to the dinosaur fields in Montana. We have a private ranch there we go to, and kids can keep what they find. You're not digging for me, and you don't pay me to dig for me. You're there for yourself. So if you want to come along, you can see me. We're doing this August 17th through the 24th. Here's what the area looks like. This bad land. This is exactly the way it looks like. This particular dinosaur is in the Glendive Dinosaur and Fossil Museum there in eastern Montana. That was found where we go to do our dinosaur digs. So with that, I wanted to close. I don't know where I am with time here, but if there's, I don't know how you want to do this, but if there's a few questions I can take.
Close to out of time. Sorry about that, loud noise. But we could do just one or two questions. We're close to out of time. While we're doing that, I brought in an article that Shane's going to be passing out to you. There was an article recently published. I had one of our teachers at our school bring it to my attention, and Mike actually sent me the exact same article, but from another person. Recent discovery out of Mexico, talking about an asteroid that had killed off the dinosaurs recently. Some new evidence to support that. A long-standing theory. But what is interesting about this article is if you literally erase two words from this article, the 66 million years that's in it and the reference to the asteroid in it, the entire article reads as proof of the global flood. I mean, it talks about the catastrophic burial of these things, of these fossils, and the rapid fossilization that had taken place. I mean, the whole thing reads like an article replete with evidence of the global flood if you just remove their interpretation. of how it happened. Instead of the flood, it was an asteroid that caused this massive water upheaval that ended up burying everything rapidly and caused rapid fossilization. But literally, all you got to do is erase like 2 little words or little bitty portion of it, and all it offers there is more evidence of the global flood. Because, but we can do
It's a great article. You know, they hid that for I don't know how long, but I don't know why they hid it, but that information was hidden.
Really?
For quite some time. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, couple of questions. That's really all we have time for, just to try to get us out here on time.
I have a question about, has anyone in recent times or in the past tried to make a fossil to see how long it takes? Let's say they got a dead bird or something and buried it and put a lot of pressure on it and see if how long it takes to make a fossil. Has that been done?
Yeah, actually, I can't quote the source, but I remember reading it. It was, they tried to duplicate the process and were unsuccessful at it. But let me tell you, there are other things being done, some quite by accident, that are giving us much more of a realistic idea about fossilization. One of them is in Yellowstone itself. The trees, as the geyser water advances on areas with trees. Of course, geyser water is loaded with silica, which is a type of glass, really. And as these trees suck up that water, of course, it kills them, but the bottoms of the trees, they turn white, and for those of you who are older, they're called bobby socks. You know what those were, right? They're called bobby socks, and those are in the process of petrifying. So they know that silica plays a big part in that, and primarily due to volcanism. That would explain why you have the trees in petrified forest, petrified because of the silica-rich water. So that's been one of the things they've discovered. They've also discovered animals that have, birds and such, that have fallen into the hot springs there and have been rapidly encased in the silica-rich water, and it has slowed deterioration of the particular critter quite extensively. Of course, there's the write-ups on rapid coal formations involving heat and pressure. They've formed coal very, very quickly. That's been done in the laboratory. They have now made diamonds out of peanut butter. That's a recent one, where carbon, of course, from peanut butter has been put under a lot of heat and pressure, and you cannot tell the difference in the diamond that's produced versus those that are considered to be natural. So we're getting some clues, but I don't think anybody has come up with a natural way, natural processes to explain fossilization.
I was just, is this on? Oh, okay. I was just wondering about the bones, like on that dinosaur. How many did they actually find? Because like in the one drawing you shown earlier in your presentation, the guy said he'd found a full fossil, but the picture that was showing several bones, and a whole bunch that wasn't there. I'm just curious, when they find them, how much do they actually find?
Yeah, this one is actually a reproduction. It's real good. Today, you cannot tell the difference. But some of the bones, like along the rib cage, and some in the tail were not found, but the skull was, and the claws and several other things. It was a very complete find. Of course, it's a smaller dinosaur. He stands about 5 feet high and is about 7 to 8 feet long. So he's not a big dinosaur. And that's how it's done. You know, there is nothing in museums anymore that is mounted that's real. They're all usually kept down below in the basement in the archives, and it's the reproductions that are passed around. And they do such a good job on them, you would never know. I've tried to find a list, compile a list of how much of the dinosaurs that have been found are actually the bones. Now, I ran into this site, and I'm still waiting for them. I've asked them about it. I haven't gotten any comment about it. From the London Museum of Natural History used to do this. They would show every dinosaur that had been discovered, and they would show a silhouette and actually what was discovered. And that was extremely helpful. And then one day, as I was doing the research, I've got a lot of them cataloged. One day, as I was doing that, it just disappeared. They don't do it anymore. And I'm not sure why. I can take my guesses, but they don't really know. So nobody really knows the complete story there.
So last year I read the book Dragon Teeth by Michael Crichton.
That's
Did I
it.
mention
That's
that?
it. Yes, I
Now,
couldn't remember the
that
title.
That mentions Cope and Marsh, but how accurate do you think that is?
It's about, I would say it's about half accurate.
He's a novelist, you know.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, it's a fun story. I mean, we listened to it all the way back from Yellowstone, just to kind of see where it was. And they do have the characters right, but half the stuff in it just, I go, really, that never happened. You know?
All right. Thank you much, Patrick.
Yeah.
That was a fascinating talk. Fascinating.
It is. It's a fascinating story.
So before I'm going to have you close us out in a word of prayer briefly.
Sure.
If you want to come up and ask a couple more questions, or did you mention where your facility now is?
Oh, I'll talk about that. Briefly here, we had to close it down. And the reason being is the owner got a hold of us and said that he had sold it to be torn down to make condominiums. And I thought, you know, here we go again. This is the second time in about 5 years that we have moved the thing. I don't want to do that again. Yeah. It's a big, big job tearing it all down. So what I've done is I put everything into display crates. And so I'll do my presentations now. It's called Have Rocks Will Travel. And so if somebody wants a talk on dinosaurs, I'll bring in several crates of dinosaur bones and set them up, you know. The kids go wild with it. So I'm going to continue to do that until we get some rich uncles in here that will buy us a facility.
Have Rocks Will
Excuse
Travel.
me? We need more condos. Yeah, we need more condos. Yeah, right.
We put an offering plate in the back. If you can help us, checks made out to Cedar Park Church, please, and help us to pay for our speaker honorariums. There's also some books and videos in the back. Take a look back there, and there's a sign-up sheet for our email list if you're not yet on there. And I didn't find the attendance roster for Cedar Park tonight, so hopefully we'll have it back next week. Patrick, if you close out in a word of prayer.
Yeah, sure. Lord, we are thankful that your word stands true regardless of what man does, and that you tell the truth from the beginning, all the time with us, and to the end, you'll be truthful. It's like Israel said, not one word of the good promises of the Lord God has failed. And so, Lord, we've got a solid history that we rely on to help us interpret what took place in the past. And we ask you to equip us, to help us learn it, to help us be faithful with it, and to be good stewards of your word. Amen.